A few months into the first winter of the pandemic, I got an odd idea. I began to fantasize about taking a trip across our nation, this nation that seemed so incomprehensible suddenly to me in the last couple of years, to put my two bully breed dogs into some kind of vehicle that would allow them to travel with me and to go off across what had become a bully nation and figure out kind of what was what and who was I and what was I mourning and what was I grieving and what was going on.
And so I went traveling with bullies across this still recovering bully nation, wanting to look back on where I had been and to also somehow figure out what time it was, who I was with, and how I was still traveling. I needed places with large vistas and no big views to learn a bit about my own fortitude and persistence, just as the pandemic time had given me a chance to really assess my own losses and griefs. I needed time to understand the vastness of what I was in. Those first days, I was struck by the dryness of the world, the paucity of water, and the paucity of company. And yet, in Dandelion, as my van was called, with my two companions and the friends I saw along the way, I had a moment of great peace. There were things that I wanted to understand, just as John Steinbeck, in 1962, the year I was born, traveled with his standard poodle, Charlie, across this nation in a time when racial reconciliation was and racial unrest was rampant in his world. He wanted to understand what he called the monster of the nation. And yet, as I traveled, I saw many things that I was surprised by. The way that things have happened, the changes that have occurred. And I found many things that were surprising, things that I wouldn't have expected, including the presence of Manaki Neko, or lucky cats, in the town of Grinnell, Iowa, where my grandfather was raised during the Depression. There was an Asian restaurant next to the Harley Davidson dealer in one town. There were so many different signs, which helped me understand both the progress that we have experienced and also the depths of our division. Steinbeck, who, when he took the journey, wrote, "I wonder why progress looks so much like destruction," also said that once a journey is designed, equipped, and put in place, a new factor enters and takes over a trip. That was most certainly true in my case.
I learned to do some things I never thought I would really be able to do. I learned to check the fluids every morning. I learned to crawl under the van to adjust this very annoying cord that kept coming loose and causing a loud dinging sound to dominate hundreds of miles of my trip. I learned how to listen to my own heart in the places where it was tired and where it was also stressed between different pressures of change and also the knowledge of loss and grief that our neighbors were so clearly displaying to us.
The tour had a certain tone of grief and loss. It was very much the journey I was on, as I journeyed through places I had never been before, and yet which I felt as if they had a familiarity. I often got off the main roads to travel for a little while on the side roads. So many of them looked the same, especially in the vast rural areas. I thought a lot about the things that hold us together and the things that drive us apart. I thought about difference and about people who had a very different view of the world than I did. And I tried to hold all of that with compassion, though sometimes it was a scary thing. I thought a lot about how when people are facing great change, they can be heartbroken, and it's heartbreaking, and how we have to honor that collective loss and trauma that we have all been holding, not just for the last 18 months, but beyond. In front of us was the road, when the road is the road ahead, We don't have to act as if the only way to bridge the divide is to go back to something we can't go back to, or leave behind everyone who still thinks we should go back. There are ways we can witness and hold multiple truths and intentions together. And I spent quite a bit of time doing that on this journey. Sometimes I think that for some it feels as if time is just speeding up, as if things that used to be the foundations of life are now being left behind. The ways we travel are actually becoming kind of more obsolete and quaint, as if the ways that used to be just for the innovative, for the entrepreneurs among us, have become our everyday fare. It's so hard to keep up with all this change, with all these different ways that things have become. It's difficult. And I think it's important for us to recognize how significant that is for those we live among. As I drove, I was often listening to authors who perhaps had never felt that the flag was waving for them. And after I got the aftermarket radio to work most days, I was able to listen to the news about the Delta variant, which was mild at the beginning of my trip, became more and more a beeping alarm, another discordant sound on my journey. There were a lot of signs I passed that suggested the morning of our nation. The way that many have left up election signs, the way that a different election ago, many others left up signs for a couple of years as an act of defiance. I was often the only person masked, but I kept the commitment that I had made, and I often felt as if I were more in danger by being masked, just going in to get gas or to use a restaurant. There were so many signs of the vast collective trauma that we are holding, and we are coming to a time when we face truly massive change, coming to an intersection between what has been and what will be. We don't really know exactly where we're going, and sometimes it's tiring to be in the container and the vessel for all of that, for that sorrow and loss and fear as well. More than once I wondered about the theological significance of the numerous flags I saw that were draped Easter style around crosses in people's front yards. I saw a sign that said, "Make farming great again," and another one that said, "We're still spraying and we're still staying." This as news of extreme weather came across my unpredictable radio. And yet, on another night, I experienced the otherworldly magic of crossing into a valley that was filled with the red, silent blinking of wind turbine lights. Everything is changing, and there is loss, and there is grief, and there is a need to hold everyone gently. I had a lot of really good encounters. I chose a particular brand of truck stop to use as my way of stopping. They have dog yards, and they also have an ethic of being kind to those who came in their doors. So whether they felt like being nice to this Californian wearing a mask, they always called out a greeting, and I took it on face value. I checked my fluids every morning, and I crawled under the van to see if I could have a day relatively free of needless beeping. I tried to talk to a few people every day, though nothing like Steinbeck's conversations in his book Travels with Charlie, though I was happy to learn that actually time has shown that many of those were fictionalized. That makes sense to me because when you're unshowered, sporting dog hair, and not from around there, having in-depth conversations with people is sometimes a little challenging.
I had some challenging times. When I got to Georgia on the East Coast, I suddenly had a terrible noise and discovered that one of the gears in my van had dissolved into rather minute particles. And yet that in itself was a chance for good things to happen, for a mechanic was willing to put aside a long line of other requests to help me on my way, and we had a chance just to chat briefly about dogs and other things that we held in common, though we probably would have, in any other context, held very little in common.
On the first day of bad air, I had a fender bender. I had one very bad night in a campground on the Tennessee-Arkansas border, where when I arrived, the host said, "Oh, it's you. We've been talking about your name for the entire day." She then informed me that pit bulls were not allowed, and while I had a moment of wanting to quarrel with her about the fact that Crystal is actually a purebred American bully, I decided that wasn't going to help me out. We compromised, and they put me on the far end of the campground, right next to the marsh, as it turned out, the swamp. And that night I received my least wanted gift of the trip, more than 100 mosquito bites, which led me to weeks of being under the weather. Ferdinand also was afflicted, and yet we kept on moving. It felt like a place where we had truly stepped back into a time where we can't value all. I felt that one night the humiliation, the shame, and the deep bone-level fear that I felt so much of my life, and it made me realize we can't, from nostalgia, just turn back to roads that we have traveled before. As I emerged from that swampy campground, full of anger and grief, ready to just burn down the whole town, all of us exhausted that whole day and the next day, trying to figure out how to just keep going, I realized that we just all have to adapt. As I stopped somewhere along the way, later in Texas, in a town where people were playing basketball at noon in the over 100-degree heat, I realized that we as a species do know how to adapt, and we just keep doing it. I stopped at a park outside of Oklahoma where they've taken up a custom of a French city of couples putting locks together there as an act of love. It overlooked one of the many rivers that always reminded me of the beauty and the complication of this nation. Mostly I traveled the distance between the tensions, the humanity of people and their inability to see the other's humanity, the determined ignorance that would place the lives of our children at risk, as I heard more and more through my radio time on each progressing day. I had my compassionate days and my angry days, and one day I cried for almost a whole tank of gas, but keep in mind, it's a 2007 van, so it's not as bad as it seems. Duct tape was my friend, social media, and the spirit traveled with me, and the people who gave me hospitality along the way truly revived my spirit again and again to the luxury of sheets and a shower. The truth is there are many signs that all of us are mourning and grieving, and that grief and mourning are sort of our constant traveling companions these days, because we know we're up for more change and that the changes are going to keep coming. And yet there are times in which there are some good things that happen in the meantime, like that mechanic who I had the conversation with about his cat bullying his dog. There were little signs, little moments that remind us what we believe in, which is ability and resilience, persistence in the goodness of the human heart, that it's real. We're not done with traveling. This next journey will be difficult because it won't be like the ones we've been on before. We're going to feel at times like we don't have the skills, the way I feel before I crossed the country, when I realized that all my planning and dreaming wasn't about real life, and that I was actually going to get in a real van with my real precious dogs and go see real people and take some real risks. I was grateful, and yet I was also always given the resources I needed. I remember the last night of the trip when I had to make yet another change, this time not to stay in Southern California with older friends because of the threat of the Delta variant. It meant that I ended up driving 15 hours that day, well into the wee hours of the morning. And Crystal, who I think often channeled the spirit of that trip, was my navigator. She sat up the entire time, even though her eyes were closing and she was dozing off. It was as if she knew that I needed her to be by my side. We had seen many terrains, and she made sure I did not see this last one by myself. I discovered on this trip that we have resources we don't know we have. My greatest fear, as you recall, was crossing the Mojave. Hey, it's me. I was just calling to see how you were doing. And I'm about halfway through the Mojave. If you get a chance to look up, am I done when I get to Barstow? If you could just let me know, that would be fantastic. It's beautiful, and I'm enjoying it, but it'll make me feel better to know when it's going to be over, because I just want to make sure. But anyway. My fear truly was about doing this trip alone, and yet I was never alone. Friends traveled with me virtually, and some days that gave me a reason to persist. And I always had my sense of that larger, holy, and sacred wisdom which stays in dialogue with us when we give it the space and room to listen. And it might have channeled itself a few times through the form of a bully dog. Our life, our world is beautiful. It's full of many treasures that I had forgotten to look for. It gave me a sense of connection, connecting to a new joy of appreciation. Whatever this next form of traveling brings, it will be tiring, it will have challenges, and yet I know from my heart that it is something that we can do together. Through our collective goodwill and our accompaniment of each other and our openness to the spirit of goodness, connection, and persistence, we can continue our travels.
I went on a trip that wasn't the one I had planned. After a number of months that none of us had planned. And it was a time of great discovery. There was beauty around me that I wouldn't have expected. And some of the places that I was most afraid of were the places that were the most beautiful. This is what I know now, that I'm glad for the journey. I'm glad that I will continue to be journeying, and I'm glad for companionship on the journey. Thank you for joining me on my reflection on traveling with bullies.